and welcome to our congregational leadership pathway. As you may be aware or may not be aware, Summit is completely virtual this year, and that includes all of our different pathways that we typically offer in person. But the opportunity is that you can still get to hear a lot of great voices and resources and speakers through the different pathways. And our particular pathway on peacemaking is focusing on congregational leadership. And in this particular session, we're going to be talking to Lorine Shaw about practical tips, practical advice for congregational leaders when it comes to the reality of conflict and working towards peacemaking and unity. So I want to turn it over to Eric Gentry, and he can introduce Lori a bit more.
Thanks, Wilson. We are really fortunate to have Lorine Shaw with us. She is the Executive Director for the Duncombe Center Solutions at ACU. She's got a background in conflict management and resolution. She consults with organizations. And so if your church has a conflict, who are you going to call? Lorine Shaw is who you're going to call. That should be your new tagline right there. I just gave it to you.
I like that.
So we are really thankful to have her with us. This is a season in which some of our churches are probably experiencing conflict. We're going to talk about that in a second. But Lorine, could you maybe give us a little bit of background on yourself? Tell us how you got into this field of conflict resolution and peacemaking, which is so apt to our summit focus this year. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric and Wilson, first for just having me. I'm really grateful for that. I jumped into conflict management. I wandered into a graduate course at ACU when I was getting a master's in psychology, and fell in love with this negotiation course. I thought it was fascinating, and went on to get my certificate from ACU in conflict management, along with my psychology grad degree. And from there, went on to work for Joey Cope, the founding executive director for Duncombe Center. And he put me to work straight away working with roommates at ACU who were not getting along. And so any freshmen, it was mostly freshmen, folks who were not getting along in the dorm, they had to come over to the Duncombe Center on the campus at ACU, and we would have a talk about maybe how they could get along a little bit better. And I loved that work, loved meeting those students. From there, I began to work a little more closely with nonprofit organizations in town who wanted to have conversations but weren't sure how. And from there, we discovered that rather than just focusing on mediation, that it would be helpful to focus on training. And so it kind of felt like we were showing up to the fire, and we made the transition to say, what if we started talking to folks about fire prevention? And so we began offering mediation trainings, but then also just conflict management trainings around Abilene. And then in 2015, when the Duncombe Center and the conflict management program moved to Dallas, we began offering those trainings in Dallas, and just have had more and more opportunities to consult with the Dallas campus. And so we do focus heavily on the training piece, and work with organizations, the corporate partners that we have there in Dallas, to train teams and to coach leaders on how to navigate conflict.
Thanks, Lorine. Was the Duncombe Center started originally just to get roommates to get along? Is that
Absolutely?
That's great.
We failed, by the way, at that. So.
I don't know. That may be a hopeless task. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And your expertise and background is so important in this current moment that we're living in. We want to talk a little bit about that. You know, we've got congregational leaders who are listening, tuning in right now, watching this. And I think that many congregations right now in 2020 likely find themselves in various degrees of conflict over things they could not have anticipated in this year. Certainly they knew a political election was coming in this year, and there's a chance for conflict there. But the pandemic introduced all kinds of organizational decisions, strategies, questions that inevitably, I think, have led many congregations to conflict. What can we do? What can we not do? What should we do? What should we not do? And as a minister, there's certainly been times where I've been perplexed by those conflicts, those questions. And I also think that sometimes congregational leaders who find themselves in the midst of conflict are, despairing at what they find. It's so disorienting. It really just leads them to despair. And they're caught off guard that this could be happening among their church. And so we were talking before we started recording a little bit about conflict in organizations. And I'm wondering if you can help give a little bit of context about the role of conflict in organizations.
Yeah, so I love that word that you use, despairing. I think that's such a great descriptor because that is what it feels like. It feels painful. It feels tiring. And many times when we've been dealing with conflict for long periods of time, which the pandemic can certainly feel like, or we have other factors like a pandemic, it can be even more painful and despairing. So when the reality is that conflict is just as natural and normal and inevitable in the life of a church as it is, for example, in a marriage. And so the difference is we don't often anticipate or prepare ourselves for conflict in church. For whatever reason, our expectation is that at a good church, conflict will not be present. And as a result of that expectation, we are caught off guard and disappointed when it does happen. Conversely, when we choose to get married, we anticipate that this relationship is, we're saying just by nature of getting married, this relationship is deeply important to me. I am connecting myself with this person for hopefully the rest of my life. And I know that conflict will be part of that relationship. And so conventional wisdom is that we prepare by, premarital counseling, usually of some type. So owning conflict as a part of the life of the church is really critical to both our mindset and our behavior.
Yeah, you mentioned, again, before we started recording, I love that metaphor of a marriage and premarital counseling. You prepare for a conflict in a marriage, but we often think, well, like, this is my church, there's not going to be conflict there, and we don't prepare for it. And so when it comes upon us, it surprises us, and it does lead us to, potentially despair. So what are some other ways then to think about conflict? I think you mentioned the idea of conflict as opportunity. And could you flesh that out a little bit?
Absolutely. Again, this is not natural at all. And so even having been in this work for 15 years, when I personally am involved in a conflict, or it has to do with the relationships, my own church, the things that matter most to me, I do not see conflict as an opportunity in those moments because it is just not natural. Conflict almost always feels like a threat. And so in order to view conflict as an opportunity, we have to be intentional in shaping our mindset that way. But when we can own the mindset of conflict as an opportunity, it's extremely powerful. And so for example, if we view conflict, those long-running conflicts that are deep, most church members, if you said, hey, is there any conflict at your church? Their first thought may go to maybe one or two kind of underlying conflicts. So they're not having a conversation this week, but they know at some moment there may be a comment in a Bible class or a small group where maybe a conflict would emerge in a conversation. And so if we can look at those long-running conflicts as transformative, as the opportunity for transformation, both for ourselves and for our congregations, then it helps us be less defensive when those conversations come up.
Okay, so you're talking about conflict as an opportunity for transformation, and you said, if you look at those long-running conflicts, especially, that those represent an opportunity for transformation. So you were starting to flesh that out a little bit when we lost you.
Right. So the reality is those conflicts, if we can see them as part of our church life, if we can not leave those relationships at that church, if we can hang in there, then they have the power to transform us and our congregations in a really formative way. And so how we respond to them is extremely important in order for that to happen. So, and how we respond to them really speaks to the opportunity of them being relationship builders. And so again, this is not natural. We are threatened typically in those difficult conversations, and the other person is typically threatened. And so as humans, when we are threatened, it is natural and automatic for us to protect and defend ourselves. And so we talk about being defensive, and it's such a negative thing. And it can be very negative, but it's also just very human. And so to own that in ourselves and to let other people experience defensiveness is just a part of the human condition. So our mindset really matters though there, because if we're not in touch with where our mindset is, then we are less likely to respond well, or to respond in a way that will ease tension. And most often we escalate the conflict without really knowing it. So.
And one of the ways that I think that plays out as well is, and I thought of this while you were talking about when you ask a leader or you ask someone at the church, do you have any conflict? I think another common response is denial, that they don't want to admit, and again, this goes back to mindset, they don't want to admit that maybe they're in conflict with somebody in their small group. Maybe they don't want to admit that they're at odds with someone else on their team. Maybe they don't want to admit they're frustrated. And so when we end up denying it, that's also kind of a mindset that we take. And what I have found is below the surface, very much closely connected to mindset, is our emotions. And there's sometimes a lot of like shame around the reality of conflict in our own life. And so we just kind of deny it. And I think that's related to mindset. So could you talk a little bit about that denial impulse? You were nodding your head when I said that. So it seems like you resonated with that tendency to want to maybe deny that conflict even exists.
Absolutely. So many leaders in churches and in organizations, when they call, for example, there is this, hi, I'm so sorry to be calling. There's an embarrassment there. There is a shame there. I hate to tell you, but we have a really bad conflict going on. And usually at the point that they're calling, a lot of relationships have been broken, and the leader is hurting really badly, and the leader almost takes ownership. This is my fault. If I had been a better leader, I would have managed this, and I would never have had to call you. And so much of that to me is connected to the idea that, oh, you think this is happening because it's because of you or because of another person, when actually conflict happens everywhere, but we haven't normalized it, especially at church, right? And so then we say, well, I'm bad, my organization or my church is bad. And if we put those labels, then we're incentivized to remain in denial, because who would want to raise their hand and say, yes, there is conflict here? We used to even struggle before we were Duncan Center Solutions and started providing kind of a range of consulting services. We were Duncan Center for Conflict Management, and sometimes people wouldn't even want to let others know that they were bringing in an organization that had the title conflict management. And so we actually got more conflict management work once we became Duncan Center Solutions. It was fascinating, but not surprising, actually.
So why do you think that, where would you kind of speculate that mindset? You're encouraging a new mindset. I think that's helpful. That's where we want our church leaders to go. Do you have any maybe speculation or research on where those negative associations, negative connotations come from when it comes to conflict?
I think it most often comes from people associate conflict with times where conflict went poorly. And when conflict has gone well, we call it change in history and in churches. And so just the word in of itself is connected to the negative experience of conflict, where the constructive experience of conflict, we may call it transformation. We may call it change. So I think that's one place.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Well, let me jump in there. I was looking at Peter Steinke's book, Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times, and he was talking about one of the things that causes conflict in an organization, particularly a church, is old versus new. And whether it's new carpet versus old carpet in the church, like how many churches in the 60s and 70s had to change that purple carpet, or new songs versus old songs, or new direction versus old. And, again, in this moment, so many churches have reinvented themselves or have been forced to do that almost overnight. And so there's probably some conflict related to that. And it just, I find that to be very true, that there is a recurring conflict in churches of old versus new. And so is that, a common template for conflict? And if so, are there tools to navigate that in your church?
Absolutely. So we've talked a little about like relationship conflict, where it focuses on the connection with the other person, but that old to new often has to do with the idea of identity conflict. How so oftentimes our identity at church is tied up in those songs, for example. Those are meaningful to us, and so letting go of that is painful and difficult to usher in the new, right, songs. And so sometimes people can't even articulate well what is important to them about the old, and what makes them so uncomfortable about talking about the new. It kind of comes from the gut, and that's usually a sign to me that, this is tapping on a piece of your identity and your history that is extremely valuable to you, and you don't want to give that up. And that's where reaching down under there and asking some key questions like, tell me what's so important to you, because it's actually not about the song itself. Usually it's about the meaning underneath the song. And so that's where that's where it really can turn to an opportunity to learn more about, most likely a church member that we've known forever, but we haven't had the opportunity to sit down and go, tell me what that song means to you. And likely that song may mean something similar to us. And so we can then connect. But if we only stay up here and talk about the song, and Steinke talks so much about anxiety and the role it plays in our church. That is similar to what I'm talking about with that defensiveness, right? And the role it plays. And so, but if we can dig down underneath there and say, tell me what about that is important to you, we can pull out so much information and opportunity to build. Yeah.
So I don't want to do that. I want to, fight with you about the song choices, right? So I'm struck by what you're saying about this invitation to, instead of engaging the conflict on the level at which the conflict is presenting itself, to try to dig deeper and figure out what's actually going on. How do I become, as you work with leaders of organizations, what do you advise those leaders as it relates to becoming a person who is not suckered into the presenting conflict and is able to dig deeper and find out what's really at stake? Like, how do you become that kind of person and leader?
So from some organizational research, we know that there are 4 responses that are constructive and active, meaning they're responses that engage the other person. And from this research around the conflict dynamics model, they found that it's not that all good leaders do these 4 things, but more importantly, people expect these 4 behaviors from leaders. And so the interesting thing about leaders is we kind of expect leaders to behave better than ourselves sometimes. And so we put that expectation on leaders. So the 4 responses are perspective taking. So that is where I'm going to ask you, tell me about that song. And I'm really going to suspend that it's about me and that song at all. And I'm really just focusing on, tell me what that means to you. Oh, they played that song at your mother's funeral. Oh, wow. And even before that, it was at your parents' wedding. That's amazing. Oh, they played it all the time when you sang it in Devos at your college, right? You will get history, family history, possibly. And so hearing that is really powerful. It's just as powerful for you to hear it as for the other person to have the opportunity to express it, right? It shows that you care. And that's another thing, you just genuinely have to care about the other person's perspective. So it takes energy. Sometimes we go in and think, I have this recipe for how I'm going to act, and then everything will be fine. People sniff out so quickly whether or not you genuinely care about what they're saying. And so you really have to bring your whole self to that interaction. So perspective taking, expressing your own emotions. And so oftentimes the person after they've been listened to may turn around and say, well, how are you feeling about this? But even if they don't, if it's a situation where you really need to express how you're feeling, you should be allowed to do that, and you should feel free to do that. However, you want to make sure you're not expressing it in an angry way, and you want to make sure there's no blame embedded in how you're expressing, and that can be very difficult. So in the most challenging conversations, I advise people to actually write out what you're going to say. Spend some time in self-reflection, preparing your words, because oftentimes it's that automatic part of protecting ourselves. We will launch little bombs over the fence, and that can really be destructive in that conversation. And then another piece is creating solutions. And so you cannot go into a conversation like this already knowing the best solution. You have to completely buy into the idea that whatever comes out of the conversation with the other person will really be better than anything you could decide on your own. And this is challenging again, because we often go into conversations with really good ideas ourselves, or strong opinions about how we want the conversation to come out. And so that leads us to be a little coercive, even on accident in the conversation. And however, if you really believe, after listening to this person, after expressing how I feel, I really believe we might come to a solution that's better than anything we could think of on our own, your whole posture in the conversation changes, and the other person will feel that. They're just going to be drawn to it. And the 4th one is reaching out. And so actually that's just setting up that coffee date, or just setting up an opportunity to have that conversation. For example, the reason you may be meeting may be because there was kind of a trigger moment for you or the other person. it's really not wise to engage in the conversation right then, because you are triggered. You are naturally defensive. And so it is wise to go ahead and have some time delay in there for you to calm down, be able to reflect, think about what you can do to be adaptable in this situation and what really matters to you. So those are 4 things, though, that we know from the research people expect of leaders, whether you're at work or in church.
Those are great. That's really helpful. Thanks,
We're
Lorine.
already getting into practical tips, and we haven't even gotten there yet. This is good. We're ahead of the game. One of the things that struck me as you were describing those, and it's related to something you said earlier, and I think this, again, since we're still kind of under that big canopy of mindset, often the way that our church life together functions doesn't allow for the time and space that it takes to have these deeper relational connections, which is essential for navigating conflict. And a lot of times in our churches, I've observed that our life together is pretty thin as a community. And because of that, we don't have the same mentality that we do with marriage, where you understand this as a deep relational commitment that you're making to this person. And I think sometimes with our experiences of church, it's less focused on, wow, this is a deep relational commitment that I'm about to make to this group of people. Typically, it's more, well, what is this group of people going to offer me or provide for me? And what I think ends up happening is right out of the gate, before we've placed membership or identified with a group or made the decision that this is going to be our community, we've already kind of tilted the scales against some of those things that are going to be essential for us to make it through these difficult seasons. And so I wonder if there is a challenge just embedded sometimes, kind of an extra layer that we have to fight through, that is kind of our mindset of what church is and what it means to be a part of church. No need for you to respond. It's just kind of an observation as you were talking through some of these things, that it takes time and space to really dig deep with a person. And sometimes our life together just doesn't allow that.
Absolutely. And trust, right? If I don't trust you as a leader, I may not accept the invitation to coffee. I have to trust that I'll be safe there in that conversation. Same in small groups, same in Bible class. And absolutely the depth of that relationship is key. I love your observations. I agree.
Eric, do you want to talk anything else about mindset before we make the turn to some kind of dipped our toe in some practical waters of behaviors? Do you want to keep moving in that direction, or do you have anything else about mindset?
This mindset stuff has been really helpful, but I'll admit I've got about 1,000 practical questions, so I'm probably already thinking in that direction, Wilson.
Lori, let's talk about practical behaviors that you would recommend, and we'll kind of start with your list, and then we'll kind of tease it out some more.
Good. Okay. So if we think about conflict, I first off, I draw a lot from this conflict dynamics model. It's from the Center for Creative Leadership. There's a book called Conflict Competent Leader, and that's the material from which I use an assessment and work, and I've just found it's very, very valuable. We also use an instrument called the Thomas Kilmann The conflict dynamics model is really taking the Thomas Kilmann just a step further, and it's more thorough. And so I'm going to mention that a little bit here. So in the conflict dynamics model, they talk about the progression of conflict. And so this idea, I think, is also very, very helpful in just understanding ourselves and our behaviors. So if you look at the beginning of conflict, what starts a conflict for us is some sort of trigger happens. We get triggered. Something irritates us, annoys us, frustrates us, and then we, in that moment, have to recognize that we've been triggered. That is so difficult for most of us. To even recognize, I can imagine what would it be like. I've never done this for myself, so I wonder what it would be like for me to map out what are my triggers at church. When do I most often get irritated at church? Even just starting with that question and making a little list. If I were to think in the last month, in light of the pandemic and everything, what were the moments where I felt annoyed when I was at a church Zoom or consuming church online? For a leader, right? They're going to have a different list. So identifying those first, and then knowing what it feels like in our body to be triggered is really helpful. So even if you identify that list and then you just give yourself 2 weeks where you're going to notice then when those things happen, how does your body respond? And if you don't know, probably someone who loves you dearly, who sits next to you maybe at church, would be able to tell you. And so I can give you an example. I've been dating my husband since we were 17, and we married after 6 years of dating, and have been married now 14 years. So I've been in close relationship with this man for 20 years. And he has taught me so much about this little thing in me, about what do I look like when I'm triggered. So I came home one day and I was fixing dinner for our children, and he came home a little bit after that, and he sat down at the kitchen table and was telling me about a very stressful situation that had happened in his day. And I was focused on cooking dinner. I was not listening very well at all. In fact, he stopped talking at one point and I didn't realize it because I was cooking dinner, and he just called me out on it. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I'll come sit down. And I sat down at the table with him, and I crossed my legs, and I'm thinking I'm here, I'm present, I'm doing it. I'm trying not to focus on the fact that I can tell like one of my kids was about to lose it because they were hungry, and I'm sitting there and he's telling me the story, and all of a sudden he goes, "Oh, it's okay. You can, I'll tell you the story later. It's fine. I know this really isn't a good time." And I said, "No, what? I want to hear. I want to listen." And he said, "Oh, your foot, it's doing this kicking thing. And that's what you do when you're annoyed." And I was like, "No, I don't. That is not what my foot means." And he goes, "It's totally what your foot means, Lori. It means you're annoyed." And I never received that feedback about myself. I told my boss, who I've now worked for about 15 years, that same story, and he just died laughing. He said, "Oh, you definitely do that." He said, "You also do this thing with your mouth where it's like you're trying to hold it in." So these are physical signs that I'm triggered, that I am feeling some sort of defensiveness, or feeling that I'm threatened in the moment. So the threat, right, was like, I might not get the table set and dinner ready before this kid melts down, for example. Who knows what it is when I'm in the meeting, that my voice isn't going to be heard or something like that. And so just identifying what it is really, really helpful and telling. And most of the time we're just kind of clueless. So that would be step one.
Can I pause right there though?
Yes.
Unless you're going to lead into this. Why is that a good thing for a person to do? Why is it a good exercise for me to make the list of things that I know are going to trigger me, or how my body responds when these things start moving? Why is that valuable?
It is step one to self-awareness and how we respond behaviorally to conflict. If without that self-awareness, we are more likely to respond out of that defensive, protective nature, which will escalate the conflict, which will increase tension. When I work with leaders who take this assessment, that's one of the first things we look at when we look at their scores. We look at what are they highest on in terms of hot buttons, is what the instrument calls it. What are they most irritated by in their workplace? And then we look at what is their highest score on their destructive behaviors. So the behaviors that escalate conflict and increase tension. And if all I have to do is say, okay, here's your hottest hot button. Here's your most common destructive behavior. Tell me a story about how that plays out in your life. And they say, well, which one do you want me to tell you? And because that's what happens. So the work that we do is saying, okay, so what would it be like when this trigger happens for you? If you were able to be aware of it and then choose a constructive behavior, choose from a menu of 7 constructive behaviors about what would be best. And then you are choosing the behavior's not choosing you.
That's good. I knew that answer, Lori. I was just asking that for Eric.
Thought you did.
Yeah, I needed it. I did. I needed it. I wrote it all down. Thank you.
Okay, what were the other ones you were moving into 2 before I interrupted you?
That's 2 is really then making that choice, choosing your behavior rather than it being your default response or your knee-jerk response. And so just making that shift. So I gave you earlier the 4 constructive responses: perspective taking, creating solutions, expressing emotion, and reaching out. Those involve the other person. They're things you do together. Most people don't actually realize that there's actually there's 3 responses that are constructive that ease tension, and they don't involve the other person. We do them alone, and that's one of the things I love about that model. And those 3 are reflective thinking. So again, letting our brains cool off, waiting till we're not triggered anymore, giving ourselves some space, and then being curious back. For me, it would be, oh, I wonder why my foot started doing that thing in that meeting that I was just in. What was annoying me? Oh, maybe it was this comment that I heard. Wonder is there something about that comment that's threatening to me? Does something about that scare me? Feeling threatened is because we are fearful. And so if we just keep digging down, we can uncover what's really going on with me there. And that is it's very powerful in reflective thinking. I have to do it like going on a walk. I have to be moving in order to think like that about myself. Sitting still, my brain kind of goes all places. And so that can look different for people as well. So that's one, reflective thinking. Another one is just the act of delaying responding. And again, this is connected to understanding that we're triggered and not engaging in a conversation right then. So let's say you are triggered. You think, I don't need to wait. I can talk about this right now. Jumping into that conversation straight away, you are more likely to, even if you have the good intention of expressing your emotions, which can be constructive, you're much more likely to express your emotions in anger and in blame and in judgment, where the other person doesn't necessarily feel safe and doesn't feel like they can share back with you if you're triggered. And so just delaying responding and say, something you said there is really making me think. And I need a little time to wonder about that in myself. Would you mind if we come back to that tomorrow, and setting a time? Or can we talk about that next week in this meeting? Because I would really like to commit to circling back to that with you. So that's delaying responding. And then the third is adapting. And this is simply asking ourselves, what can I say yes to here? What can I be flexible in here? We talk really negatively sometimes about avoiding conflict, but there's a lot of conflict that should be avoided. We don't necessarily need to go around engaging every conflict just because we may differ in perspective from another person. If it's not that big of a deal to us, if we can say yes to it, we should. And so considering, might I be flexible here? Is this really important to me? So those are the three, we call them passive constructive responses.
Lorine, as I'm thinking about just, the life of congregational leadership, these 7 things that we can do just seem invaluable to me. And so I see the 4 that involve my response to somebody else, then the 3, what I'm doing personally. One question I would ask is there, all of these seem handy to me in multiple contexts, but is there anything specific about when you're in a group setting with conflict that changes any of these, or that are there like additional things to pay attention to and do when you're in a contentious meeting, for example, when the conflict has entered not just a one-on-one scenario, but a group setting?
Good. Absolutely. So the culture of any group is important to consider. So sometimes we get to, we find ourselves in groups where we get to influence a little bit more, and sometimes we're kind of the guest, in that meeting, and so we may not get to influence it much. But over time, if it's a group that you're an influencer in, then you will want to work on cultivating safety. You will want to respond empathically to any perspective. So it's really kind of demonstrating this the spirit of hospitality to other ideas. And so if people know I can say something here that maybe everyone wouldn't be comfortable with or wouldn't agree with, and you respond in a thank you for sharing that here. I would like to hear more. Or, sometimes in those settings, it could be a dangerous idea to someone else in the group, right? And so it's not just the safety of the person bringing the idea, but you want to also consider the safety of other people sitting in the circle. And so if that's the case, then you may want to navigate away from that and navigate it more toward a personal conversation. So I would draw that distinction. So safety, hospitality, and a lot of that as the leader or as a participant in the group has to do with how you respond to those comments as they come up. That's what I would say about safety. Welcome it if it's okay for the group. If someone there is going to feel unsafe, then you should pivot and say, hey, could we talk about that privately?
Related to that, just kind of the idea of a group setting, and this is something I've done before, so I'm nervous that you're going to tell me this isn't what you're supposed to do. You're in a meeting, you're leading the meeting, and something is said or something happens that you feel it, and it kind of everybody feels it, that it just tension builds. And I don't know if this is something that I was taught or saw modeled, but sometimes what I will do in those situations is simply name that feeling and just acknowledge. Maybe I kind of throw myself under the bus and say, I'm feeling it. but the whole room is feeling it. Or maybe sometimes I'll just say, I'm just kind of feeling this. And I don't necessarily call it conflict, but I just name that thing. How is that maybe related to this, or maybe different from what you're recommending?
Oh, I would say that's really powerful, and a wonderful technique. Um, and a lot of people are uncomfortable doing it, right? They feel awkward, but what you're doing is you're leaning into that awkwardness, you're naming it. And I would say that's very hospitable, because other people then can go, oh, okay, we're allowed to acknowledge that here. Great. And even if they don't weigh in that group setting, they may come to you, on the side and say, hey, Wilson, I noticed you named that. I was feeling that too. And then you could explore that together. But you are demonstrating vulnerability, you're demonstrating hospitality, and just acknowledging a feeling, an emotion in a room that can feel tense is extremely powerful. I would say if we look at our responses, you're expressing an emotion, and in that moment, it's likely just a common emotion in the room. Even if it's, I feel really anxious right now, just acknowledging that.
Did you have more practical tips, behaviors that you wanted to give, or I didn't want to cut you off if you were moving through some stuff?
No, that's what I had in mind.
One of the notes that I took as you were talking was the difference between curative behavior and preventative behavior. And what often ends up happening with conflict is that we wait until the church consultant is called. We wait until things hit their extreme conflict. We don't address things, and we just wait until we have to do major surgery, as opposed to when the paper cut happens. And I often think when it comes to conflict, we could do better with those preventative behaviors, those preventative practices, so that we don't get to maybe some of those more extreme versions of conflict that probably create all of these bad associations, which make us want to not acknowledge it, that you mentioned earlier. Are there other maybe preventative kinds of behaviors that you would recommend, or maybe that come to mind as kind of we draw that contrast?
So I would push back a little bit. You were talking about church members. Maybe we're living kind of this thin rather than living deep, right? And I would say, even if we're living thin, even if we don't have the chance to go deep often, I would say that committing to a church membership can just be helpful, so that when it gets rocky, when that church is discussing maybe a hard issue, or that church is exploring some sort of transformation, that you commit to not putting your membership on the line. And that, even if you don't know everyone super well, but just doing that can be preventative. And I don't know that we do that as often as we should in church membership.
That's really helpful. Yeah. That's really, really good. Thank you.
I mean, that strikes me as something good for not only members, but also leaders, for elders and ministers too, who say, if we do this, I'm out. And often, I'm speaking on behalf of ministers, the elders do the same. We kind of like box ourselves into that scenario. And I've just seen that, tank a lot of possible opportunities for transformation when we approach the conflict like that. And you use the metaphor at the beginning about marriage. If divorce is on the table every time you fight, then you're not going to, work through stuff and be transformed. I think that strikes me, really true in the congregational setting.
And what can end up happening is that sometimes can become, threatening to leave, or those kinds of things can become very common, quote unquote, threats that, again, don't help create that preventative posture. So that's a really, really helpful guidepost for us.
And what we know from talking to folks who, from talking to leaders in churches, they hear from members that not only did, maybe someone left, but it actually wasn't because they had a strong opinion maybe about an issue being discussed, but it was just the discomfort of the conflict. And so, so just saying, I'm going to be here, even though this is an uncomfortable time. There is tension when I walk into church, or when I walk into small group, or walk into this meeting, this committee gathering, right? But I love you people. I am here for the tension. And what I can bring is that non-anxious presence. It's really such an opportunity to love other people at your church in those moments, because people have different trauma from the past around conflict at church in particular, right? And so if they know, I do know I can go talk to so-and-so because they seem, they're acknowledging it, they're calling out the feeling in the room, which is, I love that technique, Wilson, but they're also, they're not going anywhere. And so I can trust that they care about this group of people just like I do.
And I think that gets at one of the opening points that you made, which I think is just especially important for anyone in church, but especially church leaders, is those are the actual things that happen that form you more into the image of Christ. And those are those actual relational moments that shape us and form us in some ways that don't come naturally, but can become these avenues for formation and transformation. When you have that commitment, when you move through hard things together. And I think that's an important frame for church leaders to keep in mind. I know we've almost reached our time limit that we were aiming for. The last thing that I want to ask for, Lori, is you mentioned the conflict competent leader as a resource. And I know that we've talked about a lot. You've given us tons of great material, and I appreciate it. Are there any other kind of key resources that you would recommend to leaders who are wanting to grow more in these practical skills around conflict?
Yes, many. Another book that I use a lot, or I've actually just done it at a Bible class with my church, but Braving the Wilderness by Brene Brown. It's not a conflict book. It's not a church book. However, most often as we venture off into conflict, sometimes it can feel like we are braving the wilderness. And so she has some practical tips that are research-based in that book as well. Other books by the Harvard Negotiation Project are really popular in our field. Getting to Yes, Difficult Conversations, The Power of a Positive No are wonderful as well. And then I really love the Arbinger Institute. And they talk a ton about mindset, and they're the ones who really taught me that if you don't pay attention to mindset before you pay attention to behavior, it's kind of all in vain. And so the Arbinger Institute, Leadership and Self-Deception is one of their key books. And they just recently came out with The Outward Mindset which is a wonderful book as well.
I thought of one more question. We began with some autobiographical material, and I want to close with that as well. For you personally, as you have studied, as you have trained, as you have facilitated and consulted, what is one of the biggest areas that you have had to grow in and stretch in and transform in when it comes to this big topic of conflict?
A lot of what we discussed today in the pain that comes with kind of being curious about yourself and your own response to those trigger pieces. I am so challenged by that. I have been working on that for at least 5 years, and it is painful and difficult and challenging every single day, honestly, as I navigate work, family, church. There's no area of my life where I do not have to work on that piece of self-awareness and curiosity. And it leads me to a lot of self-compassion as well. So that was a great question.
Well, again, we want to thank you, Lorine Shaw, for your thoughts and your sharing, your preparation, and for giving a lot of church leaders a lot of just amazing raw material that we can chew on for a while and begin to intersect it with our local context. So thank you for your time and your insight. It's been really, really helpful. And to all of those watching, again, thank you for being a part of our congregational pathway on peacemaking. We want to encourage you to check out some of our other tracks as a part of this pathway, but we would love for you to check out acusummit.org, and you can find out about all the different resources, information that are being offered for Summit 2020. And so we just want to say thank you for being a part of this session today, and we hope you have a great rest of the day.